I think, investors, they want to see a clear unmet need. They want to see a clear business plan. They want to see a clear path to approval and reimbursement. All these things, exist in the GBM space. I think that there still has, despite the fact that, glioblastoma, it's not that many patients, maybe as much investment as a, bigger cancer if you're going after breast cancer or something, but investors are still excited because there's really nothing else to treat these patients. So they know if we get something that works, that the adoption is going to be very fast and widespread across the world for a technology like this.
Welcome, MedTech Gurus. Today, as I mentioned in the introduction, we have an amazing guest with us. Dr. Michael Canney, Chief Science Officer at Carthera, is here to share insights into a groundbreaking technology that is opening up new possibilities in the treatment of brain cancer. Michael is currently leading a global phase 3 clinical trial for Carthera's SonoCloud, a novel ultrasound-based implant that temporarily opens the blood-brain barrier to allow chemotherapy to more effectively reach brain tumors like glioblastoma. This technology is poised to revolutionize how we treat brain cancer, and with over 100 patients already enrolled across 40 sites in the US and Europe, and a target enrollment of 560 patients, the trial is one of the most ambitious efforts to date in this space. Michael brings a rare blend of scientific depth and practical regulatory experience to the table. And outside the lab, he's also a runner, a musician, a cyclist, and a foodie with a knack for languages, we're told. Hey, Michael, are you ready to be our guru today?
Yeah, let's do this.
Oh, that's great. We're excited to have you. So tell us something fun or interesting about yourself or your family so we can get to know you a little better.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Tom. Thanks again for having me on. Yeah, I'm originally from Wisconsin. I'm now living in Denver. I've spent a lot of time living in different places, lived in Boston, Seattle, and I moved to France for quite a while. Actually, I was one of the first employees of this company and this project that we're going to talk a little bit more about today. So I spent 5 years living in Lyon at the beginning of the company, and before I moved back to the U.S.
Oh, nice. That gives you a nice little taste of cultures and activities around the world, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, that's awesome. So, Michael, let's start out with, the blood-brain barrier is one of the biggest obstacles in treating brain cancer. I'm just wondering if you can explain to our listeners what makes this barrier so difficult and why breaching it safely is such a game changer. Can you provide us some insights there?
Yeah, so the blood-brain barrier is pretty unique. It's unique to the brain. It's a protective layer you can think of that helps to prevent toxins from getting into the brain, for example. But when it comes to drug development, it poses a big obstacle. And so, we kind of think of it as a size cutoff. So there's really small drugs can get across the blood-brain barrier. Larger drugs generally can't cross the blood-brain barrier. And so for something like brain cancer that we're going to talk about, it's really limited, what drugs can potentially get to their target. And so here we want to get to cancer cells that are in the brain, behind the blood-brain barrier. And so drugs, this is really limited drug development. So we know, the kind of number that's quoted a lot in this field is something like 98% of all drugs can't cross the blood-brain barrier. And so if you think of the field of oncology, where we've had all these amazing, I think a lot of great developments in the past few decades, many of these drugs don't cross the blood-brain barrier. Most of them don't. So, in terms of what therapeutics can we apply to treating this cancer, it's really limited, what's available in kind of the, scope of drugs that can be used.
Gotcha. So you mentioned big drugs and small drugs. And with that, are you talking about the size of the molecule?
Yes. Yeah. So generally the cutoff is around 500 Daltons, we say. And so anything larger than that generally is not going to cross.
Gotcha. That's helpful. So diving into your product, the SonoCloud, how does this ultrasound-based technology work? What makes it so different from other drug delivery methods to help reach or maybe cross that blood-brain barrier?
Yes, that's a great question. Blood-brain barrier, so this field of ultrasound to disrupt the blood-brain barrier is something that was first, discovered, I would say, or investigated almost 2 decades ago. There's a researcher who was at Harvard at the time named Claire Bohaninen, who demonstrated this kind of using ultrasound plus a microbubble injected into the bloodstream, you can use this combination to basically get a mechanical stress on the vessel wall that disrupts the blood-brain barrier temporarily. That was in 2001. One of the first articles was published in this field. Now, we've moved forward and in 2014 treated the first patient with this technology where we can use ultrasound to disrupt the blood-brain barrier. And there's a few very unique things about it for drug delivery, specifically for brain cancer. I think that the first is that it's something that can be done repeatably. So when we disrupt the blood-brain barrier, you may say, well, that's not going to be good because it exists for a reason. It protects the brain. When we use ultrasound to disrupt the blood-brain barrier, it repairs itself very quickly. So we've seen this in human patients where, within a few hours it's closed. And so we can use this window to get a drug across, but then it recloses and, appears to be safe in all of the patients that we've treated to date. One of the unique things, though, about it in terms of other technologies that have been used to kind of get around the blood-brain barrier is that it can be used repeatably. So if you have a chemotherapy agent, you typically want to give it every, depending on the agent, every few weeks, every month, so you can kind of keep attacking the tumor cells, keep attacking those cancer cells with an agent, because you never, most of the time, one dose of a drug is not going to get all of it. And so this technology really allows us to keep using that technology to disrupt the blood-brain barrier each time we give a drug.
Gotcha. So when I think of this, and this may be a gross oversimplification, but when I think of it, I think of it as like a flexible mesh, maybe, or that is opening up and then it's kind of collapsing or reconstricting, or is it actually punching a hole that has to regrow?
Yeah, there's a few different mechanisms that happen. I mean, I think basically the endothelial walls have very tight junctions. So we always talk about these tight junctions between them. And so you can think of a mechanical force stretching out those tight junctions and allowing a drug to get across.
Gotcha.
We know that it also has some other effects, like there's active drug transporters at the barrier wall, maybe modulating those as well, and having some other effects that also help to increase drug transport across this barrier.
Yeah, that's helpful. So, in doing my research, I also noted that as mentioned, you're leading a phase 3 clinical trial across 40 clinical sites, which is, I think, a big challenge, right? It's a big process. But we're kind of curious, some of our other gurus out there who are entrepreneurs or soon to be entrepreneurs, what have been some of the early challenges and wins when you were trying to coordinate this trial?
Yeah, that's quite a big question, I would say. There's been a lot of challenges. I think one is, when you start to launch a trial of this scale, for us, we were a very small company for a long time. We were maybe 12 people. And to run a phase 3 trial like this, you need quite a bit more, support behind it. And so we've grown to almost 30 people now today in a pretty quick time period. So that was a big adjustment for the company. We've expanded more in the US. So I was the only American at the company. Now we have 5 employees total in the US from a company that was just a French company. And then there's maybe getting to the other point is all of the regulatory aspects and kind of things. So if you're running a trial in multiple countries, you have to deal with the FDA. You have to deal with EMA, and in Europe is where we're running our other sites. And then you have to deal with the local, regulatory bodies in all of the countries you're interacting with. So, I mean, we're in Spain, we're in Germany, we're in Italy, we're in the Netherlands. So all these countries have, slightly different aspects to navigate to get a trial open.
Yeah. It sounds like a daunting task, and we'll get into that in a moment. But I was also looking at the research that you're doing in glioblastoma. For one, is as I understand it, one of the most aggressive and deadly cancers out there. I'm just kind of curious, how does the SonoCloud integrate into some of the current standards of care, and what can that mean for some of the patient outcomes? Do you have any feedback for us there?
Yeah, we have quite a bit. So just getting to the standard of care for glioblastoma, we'll start there. So the standard of care for these patients kind of came out of a paper from 2005 by Dr. Roger Stoop, who found that combining a drug with radiotherapy had some beneficial effects in patients. And so now if a patient is diagnosed with glioblastoma, they'll go in and get a surgical resection. So a neurosurgeon will take out the tumor. And that will be followed by basically radiation with a chemotherapy agent. And this chemotherapy has been, as I said, it was approved in 2005. Or 20 years later, we're still using the same drug because there's really nothing else that's been shown to be effective. And so the standard of care hasn't changed much in 20 years. In the trial that we're running, though, we're actually taking patients who come off this standard of care and who are recurring patients. So these are patients at first recurrence who have their tumor, regrowing again. And at that point, there's very few options. So if you look at what is the standard of care for these patients who are having recurrence, there's a few drugs that are put in rotation depending on the clinical site, but we know that none of them are very effective. So the response rates for these drugs are typically, less than 10% of patients maybe have a response. So it's very low. This is what they have to use, and they still use them because there's not much else that they can do unless a patient goes on a clinical trial, which is really, some of the recommended guidance for these patients.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's helpful. And, looking at your background too, you served as a medical device consultant yourself for several years, advising startups on R&D, intellectual property and regulatory strategy, if I've got that right. I'm just kind of curious, how did that experience shape your approach at Carthera, and what key lessons did you have that guided you into this process?
Yeah, so I actually, moved into this consulting role for a few years because I was living in France and I was a little bit ready to move back to the US for various personal reasons. But I moved back to the US and I actually continued being quite heavily involved with Carthera. At the time, we didn't have any trials running in the US, so I helped them as much as I could from a remote perspective. I also worked a bit with another company here in Denver called Cerebral Therapeutics that was developing a treatment for epilepsy. So did some consulting work with them, but work between the two companies gave me a little bit more of a broader perspective on drug delivery. They were using a whole different approach, which was to stick basically a catheter in the brain with a pump and just infuse a drug directly into the brain. So different technology, but still working in brain drug delivery.
Yeah, I can see how those experiences would kind of create a foundation or a building blocks to start to get into what you're doing now, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah, gotcha. So, and you touched on that Carthera is based in Europe, but you're trying to expand your footprint in the U.S. And we touched a little bit on the regulatory, but it's so different, as I understand, the regulatory and clinical landscapes between the two continents, really, in all those countries. Well, how's that navigation process been? What have been your takeaways from trying to work through all those regulatory groups? Can you help our gurus out with some of that?
Yeah, sure. I think I can speak a little bit to it. I'm peripherally involved in our European regulatory aspects, but I've been very involved with the FDA aspects of our approvals. And I've heard there's been a big switch. So I think historically people have always said it's much easier to do clinical trials in Europe. I think medical device manufacturers and stuff used to go over to Europe and say, I'm going to run a trial, it'll be cheaper, it'll be easier to open, and I'll get the data and then I'll come back to the US. And I think that maybe that's switching a little bit because there's almost less clarity in Europe right now around how to get approval for a trial and to run it. And in the US, I mean, we've found that the FDA is pretty straightforward. I mean, it's easy to get a meeting, it's easy to get feedback, it's easy to have an interactive discussion with them. And so we actually got approval for our phase 3 trial much faster than we did in a lot of the European countries.
Yeah, interesting. I've heard that recently with some of the other guests that we've had on MedTech Gurus, right? And it seems like all the countries in Europe, once upon a time, if I've got this right, they used to always kind of act in concert, but now they're acting almost like different individual states, which makes some sense. But at the same time, I've heard a lot of positive things about the FDA and how it's become much more friendly. Is that what you're experiencing? The FDA has been that friendly and interactive?
Yeah, I think that they can be tough. They can ask hard questions. They can ask for a lot of clarification and data, from your submission. But I think that it's everything we've seen. It's been pretty justified. They've shown a willingness to work together. They know especially for glioblastoma, that there's a really big unmet need for a disease like this. And I think that, for indications like this, especially, I mean, they're really willing to work with us and be interactive to
Yeah.
try to get the trial open and get the treatment to patients faster.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. And as mentioned, you've also worked extensively in oncology and drug development. So I'm just kind of curious because, as mentioned, we've got a lot of entrepreneurs that listen to our show. What have you learned about aligning, innovation with clinical and commercial viability? It seems sometimes those two are almost juxtaposed, and there's always kind of a balance of when do you launch and how do you launch. Can you share any insights with us?
Yeah, that's also a good question. I think there's some very specific things about what we've done. I mentioned that this field we're working in, of blood-brain barrier disruption, was originally kind of studied in the early 2000s. Took quite a while to get treating patients because of one thing, and that's the skull bone. So all the researchers and scientific community was saying we need to get ultrasound across the skull bone. We need to know what those ultrasound intensities are. It needs to be delivered safely. And so working on very sophisticated, I would say, solutions, and there are companies working in this space to get ultrasound across the bone, do a totally non-invasive treatment strategy for using this technology. Our company was founded by a neurosurgeon in Paris, Dr. Alexandre Carpentier, who went to one of these scientific conferences, and he saw all these presentations about these, very sophisticated, great, very eloquent solutions. And he said, I'm a neurosurgeon. These patients are getting surgery. I'm just going to put the device and replace the bone window actually when I do a surgery. So much simpler, something I think the scientists and engineers would never really think about doing because they're not operating on patients. But from getting back to your idea of what's the commercial viability, this is something neurosurgeons like to do. They like to operate. They like to go in and cut out tissue. And when you show our system to a neurosurgeon, they say, that's very easy. I'm going to put that in. Not a problem. So from a commercial adoption, rate in the future for a system like this, it's very simple to convince neurosurgeons that it's possible. But it would have taken, the scientists and engineers, I think, necessarily wouldn't have come to that solution. But a neurosurgeon thinking about kind of the clinical commercial viability of the option would. And, I see this a lot. I spent so many years in doing my doctorate, going to scientific conferences. You see a lot of things researchers are working on that maybe be too complex or to probably never going to make it into a real clinic. Doesn't mean it's not worth doing. I think that it's great to have this disconnect. I think we need some disconnect at some points for it to drive innovation. But at some point, if you want to make it, commercial and clinically viable, you need to ask a lot of questions and talk to doctors and have this interaction to get it there.
Yeah, I like that. Ask a lot of questions, right? And that's, we often talk on this podcast about touching base with all the stakeholders, right? To get out of your bubble or your cubicle and get out there. Well, this is a great example, right? Of, in this case, the stakeholder coming to your organization, but somebody there was smart enough to kind of listen, right, and make that adaptation to carry it forward. Is that what you experienced in how this is working now, that you got to the right person and you're getting to the right outcome?
Yeah, we are. And I think, that's always a continual conversation. I mean, if you're working in this space, you're always reaching out to these key opinion leaders, getting feedback from doctors. And we're still getting feedback during our clinical trial, on the best practices, how to use the system, how to train people. And that's a continuous process, really, when you're developing a completely new medical technology.
Yeah. Yeah. And with that, right, I mean, I'm just kind of curious now because, a lot of times folks try to avoid that surgery if they can do so, right? Some of the practitioners don't necessarily want to go there. So how's the communication with this? I mean, it's pretty complex, right? But you're also trying to help patients and get to the right outcome. So what has your team been doing to get that information out there and help with those patients and providers and maybe even the investors, how do you get them to understand your technology and its potential?
Yeah, so I think historically we've primarily focused on the clinicians who are interacting with these patients because there's an education to get them to understand the technology, how it works. They're typically the ones interacting with the patients, so we try to educate them and then let them, interact with their patients and tell them about the technology. We're trying to get more information out to patients, I think, to get them aware of that this is a potential option, that our clinical trial is open for these patients. And, there's sites all over the US where they can obviously enroll if they're interested in participating. From the investor standpoint, it's also pretty simple. I think, investors, they want to see a clear unmet need. They want to see a clear business plan. They want to see a clear path to approval and reimbursement. All these things, exist in the GBM space. I think that there still has, despite the fact that, glioblastoma, it's not that many patients, maybe as much investment as a, bigger cancer if you're going after breast cancer or something, but investors are still excited because there's really nothing else to treat these patients. So they know if we get something that works, that the adoption is going to be, very fast and widespread across the world for a technology like this.
I would think the investors would be encouraged as well because you've been able to find that clinical application, right? Even though it might involve a neurosurgeon, it seems to me that there's a clear a pathway to get the technology moving and effective. Is that what you're experiencing? Have the investors kind of grasp onto that particular concept?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, they see the neurosurgeons excited about it. They know that, they're going to adopt it right away if they can. If we get a little bit deeper, there's not a lot of capital investment from the hospital. So, they don't have to buy $1 million device to get our system in use in their clinic. It was really designed for almost any hospital to be able to use and implement in their kind of regular clinical routine. And so that's a big advantage. Investors see that, I think, and they say, wow, the adoption can go relatively fast with a technology like this.
Yeah, that's interesting. So it sounds like it's just a small ultrasound unit and perhaps an interface right to the patient. Is it really just that easy?
It is, yeah. I mean, I think just going back, I mean, we have an ultrasound implant, and the implant gets placed during the surgery. We have kind of a small desktop computer that drives the system. And so the system works by basically being plugged in using a needle that actually crosses through the skin. So there's a small port, and clinicians are used to accessing ports like this for delivering chemotherapy, for example. So for them, it's pretty simple. You can just palpate, find the port, plug it in, and then you can power it using this external, touchscreen computer that we have to drive the system. So it was designed that way for a lot of reasons, but it makes the system MR compatible because these patients are continuously followed, using imaging to see whether the tumor has actually grown or not. But very little, like I said, capital investment. It's just a small desktop computer that drives the system.
Yeah, gotcha. And with that, your team is working with the device. Are you also working with your own drug development, or are you partnering with other pharma companies to help with the drug development for that particular protocol?
Yeah, so the drug we're using for our phase 3 trial is actually a generic drug.
Hmm.
Because of some of the regulatory aspects, we still need to partner with a generic manufacturer, and so we do have a partnership with a drug manufacturer for this trial.
Yeah, I would think that would make for a very exciting conversation with them in terms of the effective use and perhaps enhancing the use of their products. Is that what you're finding?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think we've had several pharma companies being very interested. So we're always in discussions with new ones as well, and saying, hey, we can get your drug across the blood-brain barrier. Let's test out this, and whether it's for brain tumors or even other indications.
Yeah. Yeah. I would also think that would help ease the conversation with the investors when they see that going on. That probably makes it a little more palatable for them to jump in as well, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. So this really seems like a very exciting time, Michael, for Carthera and SonoCloud. What's next for you and your team? What does the future hold? Where are you going from here?
Yeah, so we're doing a lot of things. So we're running this phase 3 trial for recurrent glioblastoma, which is testing it out the solution with patients with first recurrence of GBM. But I think our device has a broader applicability as well. Like I said, the ability to get any kind of drug across the blood-brain barrier is interesting. And so we have some kind of early stage trials running also in glioblastoma with other therapeutics. So we're looking at, immunotherapy agents, for example, with Northwestern in some early trials. We've looked at other diseases. And so we did a pilot trial in Alzheimer's disease, for example. And, just last year, there were these amazing results published from, using another technology to disrupt the blood-brain barrier, but, showing that we can enhance drug delivery. This was done by Ali Rezai, showed combining it with a anti-amyloid therapy for Alzheimer's could have really dramatic effects. So if you take, an antibody that doesn't really cross and you pair it with ultrasound, you can actually get it across the blood-brain barrier and really dramatically increase the therapeutic efficacy. So I think there's a lot of things going on, but I think we want to expand the use of this technology with other drugs, specifically for GBM patients, and also look at other indications.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I hope I don't ask a question that would make you give away any protected information. But with other types of drugs and other types of therapy, does your core technology work, or do you have to use modifications for some of the other indications?
Yeah, so it still works. We've done a lot of work, and it's public. So we have a lot of collaborations. We like to develop collaborations with academic, institutions who are developing new therapies. So we have a lot of these all over the world that are testing out new therapeutics, and we've published these results as well to show that we can, use not only chemotherapy agents, but a lot of different agents that are on the table for different brain diseases.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's a very exciting time. So, Michael, first of all, I'd like to acknowledge and thank you for the time it took to be our guru today. If somebody wants to learn more, is there a website? Are you on LinkedIn, social media? How do we find out more about you and your team?
Yeah, so we have a website for the clinical trial that we discussed, the phase 3 trial for recurrent glioblastoma. That's sonobird.eu. Sonobird is our acronym for the trial. The company is Carthera, so carthera.eu is the main website for the company. And we also, put out a lot of news. You can follow us on LinkedIn, Blue Sky, connect on LinkedIn if you have any questions.
Oh, that's fantastic. So once again, Michael, thank you so much. We appreciate your time and insights in being our guru today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tom.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to MedTech Gurus. I am Sylvester Harris, your MC. If you want to learn more about Tom and his consulting services, you can go to www.pctmedical.com or email Tom at tom@pctmedical.com. Now, I can be reached at Sylvester Harris, that's SylvesterHarris 5048@gmail.com, and I'd be pleased to discuss any voiceover work that you may want for your company or broadcast. Hey, thanks so much for listening, and catch us on the next episode of MedTech Gurus.